Welcome to History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jess Edberg, and I'm thrilled to be back hosting this monthly free program for another round of interesting, quirky, and sometimes humorous topics of Ely area's history with a pint-sized historical tale in about the time it takes to drink a glass of beer. If you're new to this program, let me qualify it by saying I'm not a historian nor an expert on Ely area history. Rather, I take existing sources of information available through local resources and present them in an informal setting in the hopes of educating through entertaining and interesting stories to inspire you to dig deeper. Tonight's program is on the Soudan Mine, also known as the Cadillac of Mines. With special thanks to our supporters, the Boathouse Brewpub and Restaurant for hosting this event here, Ely Folk School and Boundary Waters Connect for access to audio equipment, Dorothy Molter Museum, which is my employer and allows me to program through our outreach, the Ely Heritage Preservation Commission with historical support and encouragement, and Ely Trivia Night. As if you have ever attended trivia, you may notice that there is often one question related to the previous History Happy Hour. I would also like to thank the Donald G. Gardner Humanities Trust for a small grant to turn last season's History Happy Hour programs into a podcast to increase awareness and accessibility of these history programs. Tonight, we are diving into the rich history of the Soudan Underground Mine, the deepest, richest, and first mine in the state of Minnesota, and the mine that very well could have been the biggest factor driving development and immigration to the Iron and Vermilion ranges of the North. In last May's History Happy Hour program, I went into detail as to how this region was used by humans over millennia. From early human inhabitants as early as 7,000 years BCE and the cultural changes prior to first European contact. This colonization of the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary land and water of the Ojibwe peoples was a direct result of the incredible value of its natural resources. In 1854, the Treaty of La Pointe, also referred to as the 1854 Treaty, was signed for land in the Northeast region and was the first major treaty ceding land to the U.S. in this region. Shortly after, the Soudan Mine came about as a direct result of this treaty and the resident Ojibwe peoples working with government appointees. In 1863, a blacksmith named N.A. Posey had been assigned to live and work with the Ojibwe people in the Lake Vermilion area to teach them his trade per treaty agreement. Little did Posey know that the Ojibwe people had long known about working metal and stone and the presence of iron ore deposits in the region. Trusting the treaty process, they gave Posey samples. What other highly valued metal in the 1800s was deposited in the billion-year-old greenstone belts of the Canadian Shield? Gold. Of course, as word got out that there was gold in them thar hills, the much less known and much more short-lived Minnesota gold rush exploded on the southern shore of Lake Vermilion. In an effort to access the new area of potential wealth, hundreds of gold miners and settlers used centuries-old 100-mile travel route used by Native Americans from Duluth to Lake Vermilion. In the process, this trail was crudely improved into a road and became known as the Vermilion Trail. Relevant to today, it roughly followed Highway 135 down to County Road 4. Of course, the state government needed to know more about what was going on up here, so they sent George Stuntz, a government land surveyor with extensive experience in the Midwest. Stuntz arrived on the scene at the same time the gold rush exploded and then fizzled out as quickly as it started within 2 years. Spoiler alert, the real treasure in the ground was iron ore. How did that happen? Well, guess who Stuntz met while in the area? And what did Posey do? Gave Stuntz an iron ore sample that he had received from the Ojibwe people. Intrigued, Stuntz made a test blast nearby, finding an impressive bit of ore. With an eye for the possibility, Stuntz gathered George C. Stone, an aspiring Duluth investor, and Edward Brighting, a mining investor from Michigan, to collaborate on a new mining venture in northeastern Minnesota. In 1875, they convinced a wealthy Pennsylvanian coal mining magnate, lawyer, and land speculator to join their venture. After sending his own personal geologist to confirm the iron ore was worth his time and investment, Mr. Charlemagne Tower Sr. agreed to partner with Stone and Brighting to create what became the Minnesota Iron Company, with Tower holding the majority of shares and financial burden. Why was iron ore so sought after at this time? Those of you who paid attention in history class may recall a little era called the Second Industrial Revolution from 1870 to 1914. Major advancements in this era include the invention of the telephone, the electric light, the typewriter, synthetic materials like plastic and nylon, and the internal combustion engine. But most notably tonight, the production of steel and expansion of and improvements to railroads and trains. The Bessemer process for steel manufacture significantly improved the efficiency and quality of steel production, further increasing the demand for iron ore. To quote Kelsey Cook, a Soudan mine interpreter and executive director at the Ely Winton Historical Society, we could have a whole 30-minute plus program on just the geology of the Soudan mine. So that's on you all to dig deeper if you like rocks. The Cliff Notes version for History Happy Hour is that iron ore is found and mined on all continents but Antarctica, with Australia being the largest iron ore producing country, followed by Brazil and then China. However, not all iron ore is created equal, and the iron ore pulled out of Sudan was of higher value for steel production due to its low phosphorus content, which requires less refining and creates a stronger, more cold-tolerant steel product. The massive industrial and technological growth in the United States in the late 19th century demanded steel and demanded it right now. As the primary raw material used to produce iron and steel for building railroads, machinery, bridges, and other large-scale infrastructure projects that were rapidly developing, this created a supply and demand cycle that lasted decades. Although the reason for the demand evolved with changing times. For the new Minnesota Iron Company to extract this high-quality ore, they needed people, a place for the people to live, and transportation for the ore to leave town. So Charlemagne Tower Sr. concentrated his investment in the area now known as Soudan. In what some may call a shrewd business move, Tower began acquiring land in the area George Stunt had deemed most promising, not by purchasing it under the umbrella of his company, but rather by hiring men to, quote, claim 160-acre parcels. Then, instead of establishing homesteads and making improvements as the law required, the men promptly sold their land to Tower. Ultimately, Tower ended up owning over 20,000 acres, both around Sudan and toward the North Shore. And with the help of George Stone, who was both a member and a lobbyist in the Minnesota State Legislature, the Minnesota Iron Company acquired more land to build a railroad from Sudan to Agate Bay, which we now know as Two Harbors. Additionally, the Minnesota Iron Company financed the infrastructure needed to both settle the Sudan area with workers and establish a mine. Until the railroad was complete, supplies and equipment, including sawmill machinery and steam boilers, had to be transported on the Vermilion Trail by oxen and on foot. In another shrewd business move, the Minnesota Iron Company recruited experienced miners from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the first iron ore mines in the United States were located. Work in the Soudan mine began in the summer of 1883 in the Stone and Brighting pits, stripping surface material from outcroppings of iron ore near Stunts Bay. Since the railroad was not yet complete to Sudan, the miners created a stockpile of ore in preparation for the first shipment from the mine. To ensure the company town offered everything that hardworking miners and their families would need to be productive and happy workers, George Stone hired Elijah Morcom, a miner from Michigan, to be the mine captain. Morcom came from a long line of miners from Cornwall, England, a location that may sound familiar if you attended the Cornish pasty program last spring. Fun fact, when Morcom came to the area, he brought with him his pasty recipe in his boot. The lure of a promise of good jobs made it easy for Morcom to recruit tradespeople along with additional experienced miners, and by early 1884, he convinced 850 men, women, and children to move to town, 500 of whom made up the mining workforce. During those early years, even though he had grown somewhat accustomed to the cold winters of Michigan, Morcom and his miners found it to be far more frigid on the Vermilion Range. Morcom jokingly referred to the mine and the area around it as Sudan, after the steamy tropical Sudan region of Africa. He meant it in fun jest. Clearly, the name stuck. On July 30th, 1884, the Duluth and Iron Range Railway arrived at the Soudan mine and carried the first shipment of approximately 3,000 tons back to Agate Bay. On August 1st, 1884, the very first shipment of ore was floating across the Great Lakes on the steamers, the Ironton and the Hecla, toward Cleveland, Ohio. Once there, the Minnesota Iron Company engaged George H. and Samuel P. Ely to sell it on the market. Guess where they ended up? Once the pit mines reached 20 feet deep, operations were moved underground for safety reasons, and by 1890s, operations were entirely underground. There was little fear of the mine collapsing, as the ore deposits were in vertical columns and the surrounding rock was very hard. The excavations followed these seams of ore downward and branched out until ultimately there are 28 levels, reaching nearly half a mile deep. Mule power and compressed air drills were used to excavate and bring the ore to the surface. This relatively safe working environment, along with a constant ambient temperature underground of 51 degrees Fahrenheit, contributed to it being referred to as the Cadillac of mines. Once it was clear that the Soudan mine would make money, Henry Oliver, a Pittsburgh businessman who had traveled to the Iron Range to invest in the fledgling iron ore industry, took notice. Oliver had established an iron and steel mining company, later shortened to Oliver Mining Company, when he purchased his first ore deposits from the Merritt brothers in Mountain Iron. He later joined forces with East Coast investor Andrew Carnegie to compete with John D. Rockefeller, who had purchased the Merritt brothers' holdings shortly after. This put a wrench in Rockefeller's plans, since Carnegie owned steel mills and he didn't. Rockefeller had to sell his ore to Carnegie. So, to ensure all three would prosper, they compromised and in 1896 decided that Oliver would mine the ore, Rockefeller's railroad system would transport it, and Carnegie would make it into steel. This agreement was finalized in 1901, and United States Steel was incorporated as the largest corporation in the world. There are quite a few other rich folks that made even more money in the mining industry at the turn of the 20th century, and more business ventures that Oliver took part in that shaped the Iron Range mining trajectory. But we won't go into that today. Mining companies learned pretty quick that by creating mining company towns or locations that provided housing and met medical, spiritual, and recreation needs, they could maintain an obedient, content, and productive workforce. Soudan was thought to be highly successful as a location, likely due to its isolation and possibly its lack of saloons and focus on supporting the families of miners, as it was believed that a family man would be more likely to concentrate on mining the ore. After the Oliver Mining Company, often referred to as the Oliver, took over, running water and eventually electricity were installed, including a pump house to provide drinking water from Lake Vermilion. The mine itself was electrified in 1924, and an electrical hoist, pumps, and crushers were added to the operation. And by 1945, the mine installed citywide plumbing in Soudan. Recruitment materials and welcome pamphlets like this one pictured emphasized both those amenities and the outdoor recreation opportunities in the area, with photographs of men and women canoeing, water skiing, fishing, and hunting, stating that, quote, "Beyond the mines lie vacation land." Shortly after, a hospital funded by the Oliver was built and staffed for ill or injured miners and their family members, who designated $1 a month be taken out of their paychecks in exchange for this insurance. Also, if you'd like to stay a night in this old hospital, it is now the Vermilion Park Inn in Soudan. Although the mining industry shaped immigration to and development of the iron ranges of Minnesota with their company towns and unlimited hospital stays, the work was inherently dangerous, and mine workers, especially those who didn't speak English, were susceptible to being taken advantage of. For example, if a miner was injured working in the mine but died on the surface, compensation to the family wasn't necessarily available as it wasn't deemed a death in the line of work. The 1907 strike on the Mesabi was the first organized, widespread strike on the Iron Range. The immigrant miners, mostly Finnish, felt that mining companies weren't treating them fairly. Culturally socialist, some Finnish locals requested the help of the Western Federation of Miners. When Oliver didn't respond to a list of union demands presented that July, nearly 16,000 miners across the Mesabi Range went on strike, with the exception of the Soudan Mine. If you attended last month's program, you may remember how dangerous it could be to speak out against the mining companies and that many immigrants kept quiet out of fear of loss of wages, their jobs, or worse. To continue mining operations, Oliver brought in strikebreakers directly from Europe and deputized hired men to protect them. By mid-August, production was back up to speed and the strike fizzled. Some miners returned to their jobs, but those who didn't were blacklisted due to their disobedience and defiance to the company and never worked in a mine again. 9 years later, in 1916, miners once again went on strike after Czech immigrant Joe Greene walked off the job at the St. James Mine in Aurora to protest low wages and payment systems. The miners engaged with the industrial workers. This time, Oliver hired armed guards, and in June, a dispute between strikers and guards broke out in Virginia, where a picketer, John Alar, was killed. More violence in Biwabik resulted in death and the arrest of the strike's organizers. The IWW struggled to sustain the strike, even after sending well-known American labor organizer Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. The strike failed by mid-September, but remains one of the largest labor conflicts in Minnesota history. The Soudan Mine avoided challenges by its employees. Labor unions were not introduced at the Soudan Mine until 1937, and there were no significant strikes or other signs of labor unrest at the mine during its 78-year history that we know of. While mining companies provided lodging and services throughout the region, the laborers in a remote company town like Soudan exchanged such provisions for certain loss of individual rights and expression. The threat of being evicted from your company housing was ever present and implemented for any employee that wandered too far from the corporate norms, either within or outside the workplace. This perceived contentment from its workers has been attributed to the Oliver's focus on stability and order, and its relatively high and consistent profitability. And it appears to have been successful. The Olivers' early and continued efforts to promote worker satisfaction resulted in working at the mine becoming a family tradition. Generations of families worked in the mine, and by 1959, it was estimated that most of the 275 men working at the Soudan mine were the sons, grandsons, or great-grandsons of early Soudan employees. It was an incredibly successful mine, helping not only shape the evolving cultural landscape of the range, but also, perhaps most notably, helping the United States and its allies win World War II. Steel was used in nearly every aspect of warfare, from tank hulls and warship armor to artillery shells, aircraft components, and even bridges and infrastructure needed for troop movement. The Soudan mine shipped out an average of 1 million tons of ore per year, a production rate it maintained until it closed in 1962. So why did such a productive and quality mine shut down? In a nutshell, technological advancements. Historically, the high-grade iron ore extracted from Sudan was worth the cost, as it was easier to process into usable and quality steel. However, advances in processing techniques, particularly the development of the taconite pellet, made taconite a material with less iron content, a less costly material as it could be processed more efficiently. And although the taconite takeover closed the Soudan mine, it has extended the lifespan of iron ore mining in regions like the Iron Range where large taconite reserves exist. In 1963, ownership of the mine and its 54 miles of underground tunnels and surrounding land was transferred from U.S. Steel to the state of Minnesota, and it opened as a state park in 1965. Since then, many of the mine interpreters and workers have been the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the miners of past generations, thus carrying on the tradition of members of the town continuing to honor, appreciate, and love the town from which their ancestors came and in which their families survived and thrived. You may have heard about the flood event that occurred this summer, forcing the closure of the underground mine. Worry not, staff at the mine are determined to open the mine back up for the 2025 season and provided me with details on just how a mine that's existed for over 100 years flooded. You may or may not be aware that the Soudan mine has always had to remove water from the shafts. It's a part of mining in the area as groundwater and rainwater runoff infiltrate into excavated tunnels. Take a look at Miners Lake just down the road. So water mitigation was and will always be one of the main managers and workers at the mine. Additionally, although a significant amount of water infiltrated the mine levels, it was never close to being a public safety issue due to the many safety indicators in place for emergencies such as this. So here's a very basic primer on how and what happened this past June 18th when 7.6 inches of rain fell in 5 to 8 hours. The Soudan mine is 2,341 feet deep, almost half a mile, with 28 levels or shafts that extend relatively horizontally from the main vertical shaft. This shaft is where the lift cage is and what staff and visitors go down and up for tours. At levels 10, 12, and 22, there are water mitigation systems that work similarly to a basement sump pump. A type of dam collects the water, allows a slow release to the pump, and the pump sucks it to the surface for dispersal. At the 27th level is where public tours take place and where the physics lab is located. Below that, the bottom level is 28, where another pump is located. Drainage ditches funnel any water seeping or draining into any level toward whatever dam reservoir is below it. There, the pumps then force the water incrementally back to the surface. Additionally, there are 17 mine pits on the property that also drain water into the underground mine. This pumping process has been highly successful in maintaining proper drainage and safe environments for workers and visitors when it rains for decades. The challenge encountered on June 18th was not the quantity of water, rather, it was the speed at which it came down. Again, 7.6 inches in less than 8 hours. As the holding dams filled with water quickly, the movement of the water agitated the existing sediment that had been accumulating for decades. In a normal situation, the water moves slow enough to allow the silt and sediment to settle to the bottom. In this situation, the pump on level 22 clogged with silt and failed, which meant the levels below accumulated water with nowhere for it to go. As a result, the lowest levels filled and electrical functions were eventually lost, affecting the pump on level 28. Now, of course, there are many more details to this than what I'm providing, but this is your brief primer. But when staff were able to repair the pump on 22 and safely descend to the 27th level on the top of the lift cage, this is what they saw. Here is the view compared to what it looked like on June 17th. With constant monitoring and repair of the pumps and electrical systems, the water level was down several feet by mid-August. October 31st, the floor was visible, albeit coated in a layer of sediment. The last week, the vertical shaft was dry down to the bottom. Park manager Jim Essig gave full credit to the staff working and maintaining the mine, who were the saving grace, ensuring the mine would survive and make it through this situation. The generations of pride of place and pride of history is instilled in those whose task it is to keep the mine functioning effectively and safely. And I hope that this program helped those of us who are not part of that history to understand it a little bit more. The park hopes to offer underground mine tours in 2025, but until then, there are a variety of trails, interpretive stations, and above-ground programming options to dive into this rich history. One notable program offered in the above ground tours last summer was the first Women in Mining presentation, developed by Kelsey Cook. Again, this program was just a small layer of what you can learn about Minnesota's first, deepest, and richest mine, the Soudan Underground Mine. Thank you for being here. Thanks to my sources of imagery and information, including the Tower Sudan Historical Society for their online resources, Jim Essig and Heather Broughton at the Soudan Underground Mine, Lake Vermilion State Park, and Kelsey Cook for informational support for this month's program. Mark your calendars for December 18th, where we'll take a fun and maybe creepy adventure with Krampus, the inverse to Saint Nick, found in the folklore of Austria, Bavaria, Bosnia, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Northern Italy, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Have a wonderful night.